In the summer of 1977, a troubling mystery took root in the heart of a quiet Arkansas town. A respected African-American pastor from the community, known for his compassionate sermons and unwavering faith, disappeared without warning. Reverend Elijah Freeman was last seen closing the doors of his small wooden church nestled near the Ozark foothills. No calls for help, no farewells, just a complete and bewildering silence that rippled through the community like a slow-moving storm. Parishioners, neighbors, and law enforcement scoured the surrounding areas, clinging to hope as weeks turned into months and then years. Rumors flourished. Some believed he'd run away from a hidden sin, others insisted foul play, but no one really knew. The only certainty was absence, a deafening, heartbreaking void. 25 years later, in a dense and largely untraveled stretch of forest just miles from that very town, something unexpected surfaced. While clearing timber from a remote area rarely touched by man, a logger stumbled upon a concealed object beneath a decades-old tree stump. What he found had been hidden from the world for over 2 decades, a secret buried in silence and perhaps guilt. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit apartment not far from the Ozark Mountains, Marcus Freeman, the now 42-year-old son of the missing pastor, sat slouched on his worn couch. It was early Friday morning, and the dull flicker of a muted television cast soft shadows across the room. News programs hadn't started yet, so he flipped aimlessly through the channels. On one station, a televised church service was airing. A preacher stood at a pulpit framed by stained glass, his voice impassioned, hymns swelling gently in the background. Marcus stared for a moment, hypnotized by the scene. There was something painfully familiar about the cadence of the sermon and the glow of the stained glass that triggered a deep, aching memory. Marcus paused, transfixed for a moment. The sound of the preacher's voice, the cadence of the words, it all struck a painful chord. It reminded him too much of his father, Reverend Freeman, whose voice had once filled a sanctuary with grace and wisdom. A deep ache settled into Marcus's chest as he grabbed the remote and switched the channel. Faith had once been a cornerstone of his life, but after his father's unexplained disappearance, that foundation had crumbled. The room returned to stillness, save for the faint hum of the television. Then, a sharp ring cut through the quiet. Marcus hesitated before walking to the kitchen and answering the phone. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and entirely unexpected. "Mr. Freeman, this is Detective Sarah Miller. I'm reaching out regarding your father's case. We've discovered something we believe is related." Marcus's grip tightened around the phone. "Is this some kind of twisted prank?" he asked, voice thick with disbelief. "That case is decades old." "I understand your hesitation," the detective replied with patience, "but this isn't a hoax. Earlier today, a logger found an old Adidas duffel bag buried beneath a tree stump in the forest. Inside was a pastoral robe and a Bible. Your father's name is inscribed inside." Marcus felt his heart lurch. "After all this time, something tangible?" "We'd like you to come out and identify the items," she continued. "I can send a unit to pick you up if that's okay." Still stunned, Marcus murmured, "Yes, I'll be ready." After hanging up, he moved through his apartment like a man caught in a dream. He dressed quickly, mind racing with questions he hadn't dared to ask in years. As he passed the still-playing church service on his television, a pang of guilt surfaced. He had abandoned his faith long ago, buried it alongside the hope that his father might ever return. And now, the past had come knocking. The squad car arrived promptly. He turned off the television, stepped outside, and slid into the back seat. The officers said little during the drive. The road soon gave way to a dirt path that tunneled into thick forest, every mile taking them further from civilization. As trees thickened and light waned beneath their canopy, Marcus began to wonder, how had anything of his father's ended up in such a secluded place? The car finally came to a stop. Yellow police tape sectioned off an area beside a large, rotted tree stump. Uniformed officers and forestry workers moved carefully around the scene. Detective Miller, a woman in her early 50s with intelligent eyes and a poised demeanor, greeted him with a nod. "Mr. Freeman," she said formally, "Thank you for coming. This is Tom Jenkins, the logger who made the discovery." Tom, a sturdy man with calloused hands and a weather-beaten face, stepped forward. "Sorry for the situation," he said, shaking Marcus's hand firmly. "But I figured you'd want to know." "What exactly happened?" Marcus asked, his voice low. "We were clearing this patch of forest," Tom began, gesturing toward the area. "And something about this stump looked off. Couldn't bring a machine in here, so I started digging with a shovel. A couple feet down, I hit something. Turned out to be an old Adidas bag. I opened it, saw the robe and the Bible, and knew it didn't belong out here." Marcus walked slowly toward the stump, staring at the gnarled wood and trying to comprehend how something so personal had ended up buried beneath it. Tom continued, pointing to the decayed interior of the stump. "This tree was probably hollowed out by rot over the years. Someone must have cut it down long ago, dug beneath the stump, and buried the bag. Whoever did it knew how to hide something well." Detective Miller signaled her team and they moved to a small forensic tent set up nearby. Inside, the bag sat atop a table. Officers wearing gloves carefully opened it. The first item revealed was the Bible. Water damaged but still legible in parts. Marcus leaned in, heart pounding. On the inside cover, his father's name appeared in neat, familiar handwriting. He hadn't seen it in over 2 decades, but there was no mistaking it. "That's his writing," Marcus whispered, emotion catching in his throat. One officer turned to the last page of the Bible, revealing a yellowed note tucked neatly between the pages. It appeared to be a prayer, handwritten, possibly something his father had carried as part of a daily ritual. Marcus stared at the note, a rush of memories flooding his mind. The man who used to recite blessings over dinner. The voice that offered comfort during Sunday sermons. The father who had simply vanished one day without a trace. And now, standing before him, was a fragment of that man's life, a fragile piece of the truth, long buried but not forgotten. Detective Miller gently stepped closer. "We're still cataloging everything, but this note could be important. Do you recognize the handwriting on it as well?" Marcus nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, it's his. My father used to write prayers like this. He believed in writing down his thoughts with God. He said it helped keep his heart clear." She watched his face carefully, noting every flicker of emotion. "We're going to preserve everything and analyze it properly. But this might be the break we've waited for all these years." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, stepping back from the table. "Do you think this was a robbery? Or something else?" "We don't know yet," she said carefully. "But the fact that these items were buried rather than discarded suggests intention. Someone didn't want them found." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. The forest around them was still, almost reverent in its silence. The weight of time hung heavy in the air, mingling with the smell of soil and damp bark. "I always thought he just left," Marcus said finally, voice filled with regret. "Walked away from everything, from us. But maybe something happened. Maybe he never meant to disappear." Detective Miller looked out toward the clearing. "We'll find out. This is just the beginning." And for the first time in decades, Marcus allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the truth might finally come to light. As Marcus leaned over the table in the forest tent, his eyes moved carefully across the delicate, moisture-stained paper pulled from the back of the old Bible. At first glance, it looked like a typical devotional note, something a pastor might scribble as part of his daily reflections. But as he read through the faint, cursive lines, he quickly realized it was far more than a standard prayer. The words carried a burden, a silent cry etched in ink, a desperate plea to God, asking why suffering persisted in a world supposedly governed by divine justice. The message was haunting. It questioned the presence of evil, asked for the strength to resist those trying to sever his connection with God, and ended with a sentence that made Marcus' throat tighten. "Help me remain in your light when others pull me toward the shadows." He closed his eyes briefly. That phrasing, that tone, it was unmistakably his father's. "That's my father's handwriting," he murmured, deep and firm. "He used to write like this when we studied scripture together. He taught me everything I knew about our faith right in his study, late into the night. Detective Miller stood beside him, her expression focused but solemn. She reached next for the robe, lifting it gently from the bag with gloved hands. "We know this garment has likely been underground since 1977, he said. "But with modern forensic tools, especially DNA testing, we might be able to pull something useful. Unfortunately, our facilities here aren't equipped for this sort of analysis. We'll need to send it to either a state lab or federal facility for proper testing." Marcus stepped forward and carefully ran his fingers across the faded fabric. Despite years of exposure and soil, the material still held its shape. "It's his size," he said quietly. "The robe fits what I remember. I'm almost certain it's his." He looked up, meeting the detective's eyes. "I agree with the testing. Whatever you can do." He hesitated for a moment, then asked what had been sitting in the back of his mind since the call. "Do you think someone might have done this to him? That he was murdered?" Detective Miller examined the robe more closely, inspecting the seams and fibers. "There's no trace of blood," she said, her tone neutral. "If this had been a violent crime, we'd expect signs, tearing, staining, damage, but everything recovered so far doesn't suggest foul play. And I've reviewed the initial reports from back then. No leads, no threats. It's possible, just possible, that your father was in some kind of personal turmoil. People do leave. Some even take their own lives." She looked at Marcus with a softness that didn't match her investigative demeanor. "He may have walked away from his responsibilities, buried his identity here, and chosen another life." But Marcus shook his head firmly, jaw clenched. No, he wasn't that kind of man. He wasn't weak, and even if he did want to vanish, why come all the way out here? Why dig beneath a tree and bury something like this? That's not an act of despair. That's hiding something. He glanced at the bag again. "Besides, I don't even recognize that duffel. My dad didn't carry branded things like Adidas. He was simple, humble. This isn't him." Tom Jenkins, the logger who had discovered the bag, stepped closer and joined the conversation. "That's a deep hole under that stump," he said, pointing. "And that tree wasn't young when it was cut. Even in its rotten state, the roots are thick. To dig down far enough and hide something like that, and then haul in a full bag, that's no easy job. It would have taken hours, maybe more, for one man to do this. It just doesn't feel like a solo act." Detective Miller crossed her arms, nodding thoughtfully. "We'll take all of this into account, but let me ask, was there anyone in your town or in the congregation who might have held resentment toward your father? Someone who didn't approve of him?" Marcus sighed heavily, looking out toward the forest. "This was the Ozarks in the late 70s, he said. A small, deeply religious and still racially divided town. My father, he was proud, strong in faith, and he didn't back down. That made him a target for some. Even though he was beloved by many, there were always whispers, quiet threats. You never knew who meant what." The detective nodded, taking mental notes. "We'll go over the old files again. Maybe something was missed. For now, we'll keep all options open. No assumptions." As the officers secured the recovered items for transport, Marcus asked if he could receive copies of the photographs and documentation. One of the officers assured him that once the evidence was processed and officially logged, they would provide him with full copies for his records. Detective Miller turned back to Jenkins, instructing him on the boundaries now placed on the site. No additional digging, no equipment, nothing without official clearance. This patch of land was now part of an open investigation. An officer escorted Marcus back to the vehicle. The ride back into town was quiet, the heavy air in the car mirroring the weight in Marcus's heart. But instead of going straight into his apartment, Marcus walked past his front door and continued toward the back room he had turned into a personal study. It was more than just a storage area. It was a memorial, carefully assembled and maintained with his father's personal belongings. After the family home was sold, Marcus had taken it upon himself to preserve what mattered most: his father's books, journals, and sermon notes. The room was lined with old wooden shelves, each one stacked with aging volumes and weathered notebooks. He started scanning the shelves, his fingers brushing lightly across the spines of the sermon compilations. They were meticulously labeled by year, their covers faded but intact. These notes were once his study guides. As a teenager, Marcus had sat beside his father, listening as he explained passages, parables, and principles. Those memories felt like another life now, distant, blurred by time and pain. He pulled down a few notebooks and flipped through their pages. Despite the yellowing, the ink was still legible. Each sermon was methodically outlined, footnotes in the margins, references to scripture underlined twice. His father had been nothing if not thorough. Yet as he went year by year through the collection, something struck him. The volume from 1977 was missing. His father's last documented year of ministry, the most important one, wasn't there. His pulse quickened. He searched the shelves again, pulled books from behind others, scanned nearby boxes. Nothing. Next he turned to a small cabinet near the corner, beside a wooden chair his father used to sit in. Inside were older, more personal diaries. He read the dates: 1972, 1973, 1974, 1975, 1976. Then, nothing. No 1970. He sat on the edge of the bed in the adjacent room, stunned. If his father had been so meticulous about recording everything, why was the most important year, the year he vanished, completely missing? Maybe, Marcus thought, those final sermons and journal entries weren't kept at home. Maybe they were stored at the church, where his father spent so many of his waking hours. He tried to recall what that last day had looked like, but the memory was fuzzy. The day he moved his father's belongings from the house, he had been grief-stricken, too shaken to take full stock of the materials. He rose to his feet, packed up one of the older sermon books for reference, and grabbed his keys. It was time to go back. For the first time in over 2 decades, Marcus was returning to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, the last place his father had preached, the last place he had been seen alive. As he drove through the winding streets, past familiar trees and street signs that hadn't changed, a storm of anticipation and dread built in his chest. The truth might still be waiting, hidden not in the woods, but in the pews and walls of the sanctuary where his father once stood. The church had once been a place of comfort, a sanctuary where voices lifted in prayer echoed off wooden rafters, where light filtered through stained glass and painted holy patterns across polished floors. It had been a house of strength, of reverence, and of memory. As Marcus pulled into the gravel lot of Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, that flood of memory hit him all at once. The building stood before him, aged by time and weather, its once pristine facade now dulled, its wood bearing the wear of decades. But despite the cracks and peeling paint, it still carried the solemn dignity of sacred ground. He sat for a moment in the car, staring at the front steps he hadn't walked in 25 years. His last visit had been in grief, after his father vanished without a trace. Back then Marcus had been 17, wide-eyed, hopeful, and devastated. Now, at 42, those feelings hadn't disappeared. They had only hardened with time, wrapped in layers of confusion, silence, and questions never answered. As silently screaming as the severed head, as downhearted as anger, drawing in a long, steadying breath, Marcus opened the car door and stepped out. Each step toward the church was heavy with the weight of years. He reached the large wooden doors and pushed them open. The hinges creaked softly, and a familiar aroma met him. Aged wood, candle wax, and something that felt like old prayer. Inside, very little had changed. The pews were still polished to a shine, aligned like soldiers in reverent formation. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic shadows across the aisle. The pulpit stood at the front, raised and resolute, just as he remembered it from his childhood. His father's voice once booming from behind it, delivering sermons with conviction that stirred the soul. A figure stood near the altar, an elderly man who turned at the sound of footsteps. He smiled warmly, eyes crinkling at the corners. "May I help you, son?" "I hope so," Marcus replied, stepping closer. "I'm looking for someone who might have known my father." The man's smile remained kind, though curious. He introduced himself as Pastor Harold Whitmore. Marcus recognized the name immediately. It had been mentioned countless times during his youth. Pastor Harold had once worked closely alongside his father. "I'm Marcus Freeman," he said softly, "son of Reverend Elijah Freeman." The pastor blinked, stunned for a moment. His face shifted from confusion to wonder, then softened with joy. "Marcus," he breathed. "My goodness, it's really you. We haven't seen you since my father vanished," Marcus finished for him. Pastor Harold's expression dimmed with understanding. "Yes, since then. How are you doing, son? We've often wondered." Marcus offered a faint smile. "I won't lie. My faith took a hit after that. I couldn't make sense of it. For years, I couldn't even pray." Harold nodded slowly, compassion in his eyes. "That's not hard to understand." Just then, the back door opened and another elderly man stepped in. Pastor Harold turned. "Reverend George Langston, look who's here." The second man, slightly stooped but bright-eyed, joined them, and upon hearing Marcus's name, his face lit up with recognition. "Little Marcus Freeman. I can't believe it. You were just a boy last time I saw you." They asked what had brought him back after so long. Marcus explained about the discovery in the woods, the Bible and robe, and the renewed investigation. The possibility that his father had abandoned everything, or worse, taken his own life. And now he was searching not just for answers, but for something tangible. His father's final thoughts, records, anything to tell him what truly happened in 1977. "I need to know if he left clues," Marcus said. "Some kind of explanation. Something to prove he didn't just walk away from everything." Both pastors grew quiet, their expressions turned reflective, shadowed by the weight of old memories. "Your father was, well, he was a remarkable man," Pastor Harold said slowly. "A calm soul. Steady. Passionate about the Word of God, but the heart of a man is a deep well, son. Sometimes we don't see what's at the bottom." Reverend George added, "In those last weeks before he vanished, we did notice something different. He was spending more and more time alone in his office, praying, long hours, and when anyone asked what he was doing, he'd just smile and say he was seeking deeper understanding." Marcus listened carefully. That detail struck him like a note in a melody he hadn't heard before, but instantly recognized. He reached into his bag and pulled out one of the sermon notebooks he'd brought from home. "I'm looking for his 1977 sermons. This one's from an earlier year. They all looked like this, same kind of notebook, same handwriting. But the 1977 volume, it's missing. And so is his personal diary for that year. I checked every box, every shelf." The two elderly pastors examined the notebook in their hands. "We never saw these before," Harold admitted. "If we had, we would have turned them over to you or to the police." "Well," George said, "there's no harm in looking. Let's check the church office. Maybe something was left behind." The three of them moved through the halls to the office that once belonged to Elijah Freeman. Now it was Reverend George's. The room still had a reverent air about it. Thick wooden desk, rows of books, old sermon notes in careful piles. They searched the drawers, cabinets, and shelves. Nothing. Determined, they continued to the church library, a smaller room stacked with religious texts and community archives. They fanned out, combing through binders, storage boxes, and dusty filing cabinets. Marcus placed his reference notebook on the central table and got to work, flipping through papers and carefully examining each shelf. The search took nearly an hour, but in the end, yielded nothing. Frustrated, but polite, Marcus thanked them both. "I appreciate your help. Even if we didn't find anything, it still means a lot." "You're always welcome here," Pastor Harold said sincerely. Before leaving, Marcus paused in the sanctuary and quietly knelt at one of the pews. The gesture felt foreign, almost awkward, but necessary. With his hands clasped, he lowered his head. "God," he whispered, "I don't know where I stand with you anymore. But if you're real, if you ever hear prayers like you used to when my dad led this church, help me find the truth. Just show me what happened to him." He lingered for a moment in the silence, then rose and walked toward the doors, lost in thought. As he exited the church and returned to his car, he didn't notice that in his quiet desperation and distraction, he had left behind the one item he brought with him, the old sermon notebook. It still sat on the library table, unnoticed. Driving home, Marcus was enveloped in silence, save for the soft hum of tires on the road. His thoughts churned like a storm. Something was missing. Something important, and though he didn't know it yet, the answers might have been just behind him, waiting among the pages of his father's words. Marcus hadn't yet realized he'd left something important behind at the church. The very notebook he'd carried from home. One of the last tangible connections to his father's life and teachings. But in that moment, his thoughts weren't on forgotten books or unfinished conversations. Instead, his mind replayed the words of the two pastors, Harold and George, who had revealed that in the days before his disappearance, Reverend Elijah Freeman had spent long hours at the church, alone, deep in prayer, his soul seemingly burdened with something he never shared. That image haunted Marcus now, his father praying into the night, not with peace, but with anguish. Could it be true? Could his father have walked away from the ministry or even ended his own life, unable to bear the weight of grief and sorrow? Marcus didn't want to believe it, but the thought wouldn't leave him. His mother's death in 1976 had been a crushing blow. They had both suffered, but his father, always the rock, the shepherd, had never fully spoken about the pain. He had only turned inward, relying on God in a way Marcus hadn't fully understood back then. As these memories and questions swirled in his mind, Marcus made an unexpected decision. Instead of going home, he turned his car toward the edge of town, where the cemetery sat in quiet solitude, cradled by rows of oak trees and shadowed by the setting sun. He pulled up across from the gates and stepped into a small flower shop nestled on the corner. Inside, an older woman greeted him with a warm smile. "Looking for something special?" she asked gently, already reaching for the wrapping paper. "Just visiting my mother," Marcus replied. "It's been too long." The woman nodded knowingly and prepared a modest bouquet, lilies and carnations wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. Simple. Reverent. Just like his mother had preferred. With the bouquet in hand, Marcus crossed the street and entered the cemetery. The late afternoon cast long shadows across the neatly kept grounds. He walked slowly, the gravel path crunching beneath his shoes, passing familiar names on headstones he'd seen since he was a boy. Memories flooded him with every step. Sunday afternoons, church picnics, the first time he came here after her funeral. He reached her grave and stood silently, reading the inscription. Sarah Freeman, beloved wife and mother, 193911976. He crouched beside the headstone and laid the flowers at its base. Then, as he had done once as a grieving teenager, he sat down on the grass and exhaled. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "It's been a while." He told her everything, about the discovery in the forest, the old Bible with his father's name, the visit to the church, the pastors who remembered his father so well. He poured out his confusion, his anger, and his quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally surface. "I've been mad at him," Marcus confessed softly. "Mad at you, at God, at the whole world. But I don't want to be angry anymore. I just want to understand what happened. I want to know who he really was in the end. Not as a pastor, but as a man, as a husband, a father." He sat there for a long time, letting the silence of the cemetery comfort him like an old blanket. But then, something unexpected broke that silence. A soft, sorrowful sound, someone crying. Marcus turned his head and listened. The sobs were faint, like the quiet crying of a child trying not to be heard. He stood and followed the sound, weaving through the rows of graves until he found a small figure sitting against the trunk of a tree a few rows away. "Hey there," Marcus said gently as he approached, careful not to startle the boy. "You okay?" The child looked up, face streaked with tears. He couldn't have been more than 10. His eyes were red and he looked exhausted. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, crouching beside him. The boy wiped his nose and sniffled. Robbie Hark." Marcus's heart tightened. "Where are your parents, Robbie?" The boy didn't speak right away. Instead, he lifted a small hand and pointed toward a grave a few feet away. Marcus's eyes followed the gesture and settled on a headstone with fresh flowers and recently disturbed earth. Is someone here with you? A guardian? Still, Robbie didn't answer. His eyes darted away, and his shoulders sank. I can help take you home if you'd like, Marcus offered gently. Please, not home, Robbie whispered, voice trembling. They don't like me there, my aunt and uncle. Marcus felt the words hit him like a punch to the chest. After his own parents were gone, he had lived with his aunt and uncle too, and like Robbie, he had been made to feel like an unwanted burden. I understand, he said softly. I really do. I'll stay with you for a bit, okay? But eventually we've got to let someone know where you are. Your family might be worried. Robbie didn't respond. Marcus reached out and placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. But the moment he touched him, he recoiled slightly. Robbie, you're burning up, Marcus said with alarm. You've got a fever. You need to see a doctor. No, the boy whispered, eyes wide with fear. Please don't take me home. I won't, Marcus assured him. But I can't leave you out here either. You need medicine. Maybe the hospital? The boy was quiet for a moment, then said, Can you take me to a church instead? Marcus blinked. A church? When my mom was alive, Robbie said, she'd take me to church if I was sick. She'd ask the pastor for something called the Holy Communion to bring home. She'd pray over it, and I'd get better. Marcus's breath caught in his chest. He knew exactly what Robbie meant. His own father had done the same thing countless times, preparing take-home communion for the sick and elderly who couldn't attend service. Marcus had helped with those preparations as a boy, holding the silver trays and folding the linens. I know about that, Marcus said. My dad used to do that when he was the pastor at Mount Olive. He paused, thinking carefully, then made a promise. Here's what we'll do. If you agree to come to the hospital with me, I'll go back to the church and bring you the communion. We can take it together at the hospital. How's that sound? Robbie hesitated, then nodded. As they walked to Marcus's car, a sudden thought made his stomach drop. The notebook. He hadn't seen it since the church. In his distraction, in all the emotion of returning and reconnecting with old pastors, he had left it behind, on the library table. I left my book, he muttered. Damn. Still, he would deal with that later. He drove Robbie to the emergency room and explained the situation to the nurse at the front desk. How he had found the boy alone, how he might be living with relatives, but didn't feel safe at home. He gave the boy's name and hoped the hospital could track down his records. Before Robbie was taken back for treatment, he looked up at Marcus. You promised, he said, voice small but firm. The communion. Marcus gave him a reassuring nod. I always keep my promises, he said. I'll be back soon. He signed the paperwork, offered to cover the initial treatment costs, and stepped back out into the evening air. The sun was nearly gone now, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He would head back to the church, but now with two missions: to retrieve the forgotten notebook and to fulfill a promise made to a little boy who reminded him too much of his own past. The sky had grown darker by the time Marcus stepped out of the hospital. The deep hues of early evening painted the clouds in fading tones of gray and blue. As he walked to his car, he wasn't thinking about errands or traffic or even dinner. His mind remained fixed on everything he had just witnessed, everything he had just promised. A small, sick child was waiting, and Marcus had vowed to bring him something sacred, the Holy Communion his own father had once prepared for the sick and bedridden. In his memories, sliding into the driver's seat, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He still had the church's old number saved from years ago. He tried it now, holding the phone to his ear, hoping someone might answer. The line rang. Once, twice, then silence. No answer. No voicemail. Unwilling to waste time, Marcus started the car and made his way back toward Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. He needed to retrieve the communion set, and more pressingly, something else tugged at his memory. The notebook, the one he'd left behind. 15 minutes later, he pulled into the familiar lot again. The lot was empty. The church building stood quiet beneath the dusk. its stained glass windows glowing faintly from interior light. Marcus stepped inside and was immediately greeted by a young man wearing a button-up shirt and name tag. "Can I help you, sir?" the young staff member asked politely, clearly not recognizing him. "I'm looking for Pastor Harold or Reverend George," Marcus replied, glancing around. The young man shook his head. "They're at the church cemetery right now, performing blessings." Marcus frowned. Cemetery blessings? That didn't sound familiar, not at this hour. "Is that normal?" he asked, curious. The staffer shrugged. "They've done it a few times since I started. I don't really know the details." Marcus nodded slowly but said nothing more. He shifted focus. "Well, I was here earlier today, speaking with Pastor Harold and Reverend George. I left a book in the library. Also, I need to collect a take-home Holy Communion for a child in the hospital." The young man didn't question him. In fact, he seemed to accept Marcus's story without hesitation. "I can help you with both," he said. "Let's check the library first." They walked together through the now quiet corridors. The library looked just as they had left it, though someone had since restored order. Books had been neatly reshelved, drawers closed, and tables cleared. Marcus's eyes scanned the room, and there it was, his father's notebook, right where he'd left it. He picked it up and held it for a moment, letting a small wave of relief pass through him. As his eyes scanned the shelves one last time, something caught his attention. A thick book on the topmost shelf jutted out at an awkward angle, dangerously close to toppling. "I should fix that before it falls and hurts someone," Marcus said, stepping forward. "I can take care of that later," the staff member offered, but Marcus was already reaching. He was tall and didn't need a ladder to grab it. As his fingers grasped the spine, the book slipped slightly. It was heavier than expected, and dropped with a dull thud onto the floor. "Sorry," Marcus said quickly, bending to retrieve it. The title caught his eye: Church Financial Management and Stewardship. But what truly grabbed his attention wasn't the title. It was the handwriting in the margins. Familiar, bold, deliberate. His father's handwriting. "Is this book available to borrow?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The staff member hesitated. "We'd need to record it in the library log, but yes, if you check it out properly." "Of course," Marcus said. They moved to the front desk, and the staff member logged the book, stamping the inside cover. With both his notebook and the newly discovered volume in hand, Marcus followed the young man down the hallway. "I'll go retrieve the communion from the sacristy," the staffer said. "May I come with you?" Marcus asked. "I used to help there when my father, Reverend Elijah Freeman, served here." The staff member paused, looking suddenly uncomfortable. "I've heard about Reverend Elijah," he said. "But I'm sorry, church policy doesn't allow visitors in the sacristy." Marcus nodded. He understood. He watched as the young man disappeared through a side door, leaving him alone in the hallway. He took a seat on a nearby bench and opened the book of financial stewardship. The margin notes were unmistakable. His father's handwriting marked key passages with underlines, circles, and bold comments. One section was especially highlighted. "God sees how we handle his money. Church funds are not personal assets. They are sacred trusts. Leaders must manage them with honesty and integrity." In the margin, Elijah Freeman had written, "Accountability to God first, then to the congregation." Marcus turned the pages slowly, absorbing each note. But then something odd caught his attention. Faint impressions, almost invisible pencil marks, as if someone had written something and then erased it. Knowing his father's habits, he tilted the page toward the hallway light. Elijah Freeman had always pressed hard when writing in pencil, often leaving indentations even after erasing. As the light shifted across the page, two names began to emerge: Harold Whitmore, George Langston. Both names had faint question marks beside them. Marcus felt a chill crawl down his spine. These weren't random annotations. These were intentional, hidden messages. Surrounding those names were paragraphs underlined in red ink, sections discussing embezzlement, financial mismanagement, and the biblical principles for confronting wrongdoing within church leadership. Was it possible his father had suspected his fellow pastors of mishandling church funds? Had he discovered something unethical and kept quiet, trying to handle it internally, perhaps prayerfully? Was that what had caused his late-night anguish and isolated devotion? Through a nearby side window, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement. 2 silhouettes, older men, stood at the cemetery near the edge of the church property. It had to be them, Pastor Harold and Reverend George. But what were they doing out there now, in the dimming light, alone? Just then, the staff member returned, carrying a small cloth bag. "Here you are, sir. The communion set." "Thank you," Marcus said, accepting it with care. He hesitated, then gestured toward the window. "By the way, do you know exactly what the pastors are doing out there? I can see them from here." The staffer glanced briefly. "Just blessing the graves. Like I said, they've done that before. I'm not sure when they started. I was downstairs in the cellar earlier, cleaning." Marcus nodded and thanked him again. With the notebook, the borrowed book, and the communion in hand, he stepped outside into the fading light. The air had cooled. A light breeze stirred the trees around the churchyard. Marcus paused on the steps, feeling the weight of everything he now carried, not just in his arms, but in his heart. His father's sermon notes, a suspicious book with hidden markings, and a growing realization that this place, this sanctuary of prayer, might also be a vault for secrets never meant to be uncovered. Something was not right at Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, and Marcus was determined to find out what it was. Marcus had initially intended to head straight to his car, return to the hospital, and fulfill the promise he made to Robbie. But something tugged at him, a lingering sense of unfinished business. He glanced back at the cemetery, just past the grassy field separating it from the church. He decided to take a detour and personally thank Pastor Harold and Reverend George for their earlier help. Perhaps, he thought, he could also get a read on their reactions to his unexpected return and his questions about the financial book. As Marcus approached the cemetery, the last traces of sunlight were fading from the sky. Shadows stretched long across the headstones. What he saw next made him stop in his tracks. Reverend George was standing in a shallow trench, shoveling earth onto a small mound. Pastor Harold stood a few feet away, holding a canvas bag, one that looked strangely out of place. Neither man noticed Marcus at first, engrossed in whatever they were doing. Not wanting to startle them, Marcus called out from a short distance. "Good evening," he said, loud enough to carry across the quiet yard. Both men jumped slightly, their heads snapping in his direction. The look on their faces wasn't just surprise, it was something deeper, something uneasy. "Marcus," Pastor Harold said, his voice pitched higher than usual. "What brings you back so soon?" "I'm sorry if I startled you," Marcus said calmly, walking closer. "I came back for my book. I'd left it in the church library, and I needed to pick up the communion set for the child I mentioned earlier. He's in the hospital." He glanced at Reverend George's shovel, then at the mound of freshly disturbed soil. "What are you two doing out here at this hour?" The two pastors exchanged a quick glance, as if silently deciding who would respond. "We were just," Pastor Harold began. "Blessing the graveyard," Reverend George cut in swiftly. "We noticed an old grave, a dog's grave, from a former member of the congregation." "Yes," Harold added quickly. "We got permission from the family to move the remains. The cemetery's filling up and we need to make room for future burials." Marcus nodded slowly but said nothing. Their explanation didn't sit right. Grave relocations, especially of pets, weren't common practice, certainly not at twilight, and the whole thing felt oddly rushed, secretive even. But he chose not to confront them directly. "I see," he said neutrally. "I didn't mean to interrupt, I just wanted to let you know I was back to retrieve my things." Pastor Harold's eyes dropped to the book under Marcus's arm, Church Financial Management and Stewardship, and something in his expression tightened. "Did another one you took from the library?" he asked, tone carefully casual. Marcus nodded. "Yes, it fell from a shelf while I was retrieving my notebook. When I opened it, I noticed my father's handwriting in the margins. The young staff member helped me check it out." Reverend George's shoulders stiffened slightly. He was trying to maintain his composure, but Marcus didn't miss the tension that gripped his posture. "Your father had an interest in that book," George said, voice low. "Just remember to return it by Sunday." "Of course," Marcus replied. "Anyway, I need to head back to the hospital. The boy's waiting." He gave a polite nod and turned to walk back toward his car, feeling the weight of both men's eyes fixed on his back. Once inside his vehicle, he resisted the urge to drive off immediately. Instead, he watched through the windshield. Pastor Harold and Reverend George hadn't moved. They stood in close proximity, heads tilted toward one another in what appeared to be a tense exchange. Their body language, guarded, tight, was not that of men casually finishing up a blessing or tending to cemetery space. Marcus reached for his car key, preparing to start the engine, when his phone rang. "Mr. Freeman, this is Nurse Jenkins from County General," said a warm but urgent voice. "The boy you brought in, Robbie, he's asking for you. His family arrived just a little while ago." "Thank you," Marcus said. "Please let him know I'm on my way." He was about to pull out of the lot when movement in his rearview mirror caught his attention. Reverend George had walked to a nearby vehicle, a dark-colored sedan parked beneath a street lamp on the far edge of the cemetery. Marcus watched as the Reverend loaded the shovel and the canvas bag into the trunk. A moment later, George climbed into the driver's seat and without hesitation sped off down the side road, exiting through a secondary access point that led away from town. Pastor Harold, meanwhile, headed briskly back toward the church, entering through a rear entrance and disappearing from view. Marcus sat still, the gears in his mind turning rapidly. Something didn't add up. And then a strange thought gripped him. Where was George going? He knew this area well. That road didn't lead to residential neighborhoods or church offices. It ran into the forest, winding into remote mountain trails and old timber roads. There were no homes out that way, just trees, cliffs, and wilderness. And George was driving fast, too fast for someone just transporting a deceased pet's remains. Marcus made a decision. He turned the ignition, swung the car around, and began following the Reverend at a safe distance. His heart pounded, not just with adrenaline but with the weight of a truth he could almost touch. Something about this felt tied to his father. It had to be. As the Reverend's tail lights grew smaller in the distance, Marcus picked up his phone and called the only person he trusted with what he was about to say. "Detective Miller," came the familiar voice. "It's Marcus Freeman," he said, eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. "Mr. Freeman, everything all right?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I'm following Reverend George Langston. He was digging in the church cemetery this evening, claimed it was for a pet's remains, but now he's speeding into the forest with a shovel and a bag. I don't think this is what it seems." There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Freeman," Detective Miller said cautiously, "do not pursue him. Turn around, let us handle this." "I can't," Marcus said, accelerating slightly to maintain visual contact. "He's heading toward the mountain roads. There's nothing out there except woods. If he's hiding something, if this has anything to do with my father, I need to know." "Marcus, I'm serious. Don't put yourself in danger. You're not trained for this." "I'll be careful," Marcus said, "but I can't turn back, not now." He hung up, placed the phone on the passenger seat, and gripped the wheel tighter. The forest loomed ahead, dark and unforgiving, but Marcus wasn't afraid. He was closer now than he'd ever been, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening as he pressed deeper into the darkening forest. Detective Miller's voice crackled through the phone on speaker. "Mr. Freeman, do not engage with him under any circumstances. Keep the line open. Tell me exactly where you are and what you see. My officers are en route and approximately 10 minutes behind you." "I understand," Marcus replied, steadying his breath. "But I'm not turning back. Not now." Now, the forest pressed in from both sides of the narrow road, the trees growing taller and denser as the town disappeared behind him. Marcus kept his eyes on the tail lights ahead, watching as Reverend George's car twisted along the curves of Mountain View Road. The road itself sloped upward in a long, gradual incline, the elevation rising with every mile. "We're about 5 miles northeast of the town now," Marcus reported, "just past the last residential marker. It's nothing but forest out here." As he drove, Marcus began to relay everything that had been gnawing at his thoughts since leaving the church. He told Detective Miller about the financial book, the annotations, the erased pencil marks in his father's familiar handwriting, the names circled with suspicion. He described the strange timing of the cemetery ritual and how the book had been oddly disturbed, as if someone had recently gone through it or tried to hide it. "Someone placed it back on the top shelf after I left," he said, "and it wasn't there the first time I looked. Someone didn't want me to find it." His voice grew tighter. "I think my father was onto something before he vanished, and I think the people he trusted most, Pastor Harold and Reverend George, knew it." The road narrowed further, and the trees gave way to a sudden clearing. Ahead, red brake lights flared. The Reverend's car slowed, then turned into a gravel pull-off. Eagle Point Lookout, a scenic cliffside area overlooking the valley and the winding river far below. Marcus's heart thudded. "He's stopping," he whispered. "We're at Eagle Point. He's pulling into the lookout." "Stay in the car," Miller warned, her voice sharp. "Do not confront him. Officers are close." "I'll stay back," Marcus said, pulling over at a bend in the road about 100 yards away. From his position, he could just make out the Reverend's car, parked near the overlook. He switched off his headlights and leaned forward. Reverend George stepped out of his vehicle and opened the trunk. The glow of a headlamp flared to life, strapped across his forehead. From the trunk, he pulled out the same shovel Marcus had seen at the cemetery, and a large plastic bag. Marcus's blood turned cold. The Reverend crossed to the edge of the lookout, where a wooden staircase descended to a lower viewing platform that hugged the cliffside. With the bag and shovel in hand, he began his careful descent, headlamp bobbing like a lone firefly in the dark. "He's heading down to the lower trail," Marcus whispered into the phone. "The path's narrow and dangerous at night. That trail runs right along the cliff. If he slips..." "Stay in your car," Miller repeated firmly. "He could be disposing of evidence. Officers are almost there." But Marcus couldn't just sit still. Every instinct screamed at him. This wasn't just about hiding something. Reverend George was trying to erase something. Or someone. A surge of adrenaline flooded Marcus's chest. "I'm sorry, Detective. I have to see what he's doing." Ignoring her protests, Marcus grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and opened the car door. The forest air was sharp and cool. He moved quickly but cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the gravel path. At the top of the stairs, he saw the Reverend's light flickering below. Marcus descended the steps one at a time, heart racing. The sound of the river far below echoed faintly, a constant, ghostly whisper. "Reverend George," Marcus called out when he reached the bottom platform. The older man spun around in surprise, his headlamp blinding Marcus for a split second. When the light shifted, Marcus could see the wild expression on his face. Surprise, fear, and something else. Rage. "What are you doing here?" George barked. "Have you been following me?" "I saw you leaving the church and I got concerned," Marcus said, approaching slowly. "It's dangerous out here at night. What's in the bag?" George said nothing. Marcus glanced at the ground, at the place where the man stood with the shovel poised. His stomach twisted. "You told me it contained remains from a dog's grave," Marcus said. "But that's not true, is it?" Silence. Then the Reverend's jaw clenched. "You know, don't you?" he said, voice low and brittle. "I don't know what you mean," Marcus replied, his heart hammering. "Don't pretend," George snapped, his voice rising. "Don't play dumb." Before Marcus could respond, the wail of police sirens pierced the night. Flashing red and blue lights lit the forest like strobes. George's head jerked toward the sound, panic flashing across his face. "You called the police?" he gasped. The plastic bag slipped from his grasp, thudding onto the wooden trail. The sound it made, solid, heavy, was not what one would expect from a bag of soil or animal remains. Seizing the moment, Marcus lunged forward and pulled the bag open. Inside were 2 dusty books, both wrapped in old cloth and sprinkled with loose earth. Even in the dim light, Marcus recognized the covers. His father's missing sermon notebook from 1977, and the personal diary from that same year. His breath caught. "You hid these?" Marcus whispered, staring at George. "You were trying to get rid of them?" George didn't speak. "And those weren't dog remains back at the cemetery, were they?" Marcus said, his voice rising. "That grave you disturbed, those were my father's. You were going to toss his remains into the river." From above, Detective Miller's voice rang out over the trail. "Police! Stay where you are!" Spotlights hit the platform as officers spilled out of their vehicles, rushing toward the stairs. Reverend George backed away from Marcus, eyes darting from the bag to the cliff. With a sudden, desperate motion, he stepped toward the safety railing and climbed over it. "No!" Marcus shouted, dropping the bag and lunging forward. "Don't do this!" But George's feet found the edge, and the night held its breath. "This is better than facing arrest and shame," Reverend George muttered, his hands trembling as he stepped toward the edge of the cliff. His voice was grim, detached, like a man already halfway to letting go. Marcus lunged forward, reaching out desperately, but the Reverend was just beyond his grasp. The man leaned forward, knees bending slightly, as if steeling himself to leap into the abyss. "Wait!" Marcus shouted, but the words barely left his mouth before two officers burst onto the platform behind him. They moved fast, too fast for the Reverend to react. In a single coordinated motion, they grabbed him by both arms and yanked him backward, away from the precipice. "No!" Reverend George screamed, thrashing against their grip. "Let me go!" "You won't meet your God's judgment that easily," one of the officers muttered grimly, tightening his hold. "You'll face the judgment of this world first." Reverend George collapsed to his knees as they pulled him away from the cliff's edge, the weight of despair pressing down on him. Marcus, breathless and shaken, stood still, watching it all unfold. The bag containing the remains lay open beside him, dust swirling gently around it as the wind picked up. Detective Miller's voice came through the radio again, calm but firm. She was already coordinating the next steps. "We need a unit at the church immediately. Take Pastor Harold into custody. He may be directly involved." Within minutes, additional patrol cars had arrived, officers securing the area and cataloging everything that had been recovered. The plastic bag, the shovel, and, most importantly, the two dust-covered books were carefully collected. Reverend George, now subdued and resigned, was read his rights and escorted to a patrol vehicle. He didn't resist. His eyes were hollow, as if he had finally realized the full weight of what he had done. Detective Miller approached Marcus near the cliffside. He was still visibly shaken, his breath uneven, eyes fixed on the bag that had nearly disappeared over the edge, forever. "I told you not to approach him," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. Marcus gave a slight nod, not bothering to argue. "But I understand why you did," she added after a pause. "It's a miracle you got here in time." Marcus exhaled deeply. "He would have thrown my father's ashes, and everything else, into that canyon. It would have all been lost." He swallowed hard and then looked up at her. "Detective, I have one favor to ask. Could someone call the hospital and let the nurse know I'll be late getting back? I promised the boy I'd return with the communion." "We'll make sure they get the message," she said gently. "Don't worry." Together they walked back up the trail, climbing slowly toward the parking lot, where flashing police lights cast a surreal glow on the surrounding trees. Marcus paused near the top, turning to look back at the cliff one last time. That was nearly the end of the case, of the truth, of everything his father had left behind. At the police station, Marcus parked behind the caravan of patrol vehicles. Inside, he caught a glimpse of Reverend George being processed, fingerprinted, photographed, silent. But what shocked him more was the sight of Pastor Harold. The older man was already in custody, his wrists cuffed, being led slowly toward a holding cell. His expression was unreadable, but Marcus sensed a deep tension in his posture, like a man who knew the storm had finally arrived. Detective Miller led Marcus to a conference room where evidence technicians were working methodically. The table was covered with plastic-sealed items, each carefully cataloged and labeled. There were the two recovered books, the missing 1977 sermon notebook and the long-lost personal diary of Elijah Freeman. The financial textbook Marcus had borrowed was also there, along with the grave soil, bone fragments, and part of what appeared to be a human skull. The shovel rested on a tarp nearby, still coated in damp earth. Marcus stepped closer, staring at the skeletal remains. His stomach turned, but he forced himself to stay upright. "Are those?" he began. "We believe these are your father's remains," Detective Miller said softly. "But we'll need DNA testing to confirm. We'll expedite it." Marcus gave a slow nod. "Of course." Despite his unease, he remained steady. "What happens now?" "We need your full statement," she said, "from start to finish. Everything you've observed, everything you've found, every conversation. We'll also need you to formally identify these items as belonging to your father." For the next hour, Marcus recounted the entire chain of events. From the initial phone call that morning to his visit to the church, his discovery of the notebook and financial records, and the eerie encounter at Eagle Point. He spoke in detail about the annotations in the book, his father's concerns about financial misconduct, and his growing suspicion that his father had been silenced. As he spoke, forensic technicians continued working carefully with the recovered diary. One of them, wearing protective gloves, approached the table. "This is in terrible condition," the technician said. "The leather's cracked. The pages are swollen and fused. There's heavy mold damage. It's basically a brick of pulp in some places." "Can anything be recovered?" Miller asked. "We're working on it. Some areas are less degraded. We've managed to separate a few of the outer pages." Marcus leaned in as they displayed a page, fragile and yellowed but still legible in spots. The faded handwriting was unmistakable. "I cannot ignore this any longer," the words read. "The missing funds now exceed $10,000, 0 cents. I confronted Harold and George privately. They denied everything, but the documentation is clear. I've prayed for clarity, but I cannot let this pass. They must be held accountable, not out of vengeance, but truth. Quiet resolution is best, but the truth must not be buried." One of the officers shook his head. "It's remarkable this page survived at all, and even more remarkable the finance book was just sitting on a library shelf." "Someone erased those names," another officer added. "But they didn't destroy the book. They must have thought it was safe after all these years." "Or they buried the diary after the body," someone else said. "Otherwise it would have been too far gone to recover." Attention then turned to the sermon notebook. Unlike the diary, it was in much better shape. Detective Miller theorized aloud. This one might have stayed hidden in the church for years, probably kept somewhere dry, maybe even in George's office. They must have decided recently to get rid of it. The notebook chronicled the first 4 months of 1977. The final entries, written in the weeks before Reverend Freeman vanished, had an increasingly urgent tone. His sermon themes focused on moral courage, spiritual integrity, and the power of truth. One sermon, dated just a week before his disappearance, was titled, "The Courage to Confront Evil with Love," based on Matthew 18:15-17. Marcus read the notes. "When you see wrongdoing, particularly within the body of the church, you are called to confront it not with malice, but with righteousness. First, speak privately. Then bring witnesses. If still unheeded, let the truth be known to the congregation. This is not vengeance, it is redemption." As the evidence was processed, an officer stepped into the room with an update from the interrogation wing. "Pastor Harold is denying all involvement," the officer reported. "He claims he had no idea what George was planning, but—" The officer hesitated, his expression grim. "Reverend George," he broke down, "he's been sobbing for the last 30 minutes. Said he deserves whatever happens to him." Marcus looked up, his breath catching. "Helped you confess," the officer continued. "Said he and Harold resented your father. Deeply. Said your father's devotion, his principles, and yes, his race, made him a target." Marcus closed his eyes. Even after all these years, the truth was finally rising from the grave. Marcus sat down heavily, the truth hitting him like a landslide. The officer stood before him, calm yet compassionate, recounting the confession that had just shattered a 25-year-old silence. "According to Reverend George," the officer began, "your father confronted both him and Pastor Harold after discovering their embezzlement of church funds. He gave them an ultimatum: either come clean before the congregation and step down from their positions, or he would expose their actions himself during the upcoming Sunday service. Marcus stared at the tabletop, unable to meet the officer's eyes. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the quiet dignity of his father with the violence of what had followed. That Friday evening in 1977, the officer continued, there was a heated argument in the church basement. It escalated. George confessed that both he and Harold attacked your father. Marcus's breath caught. Strangled him, the officer said gently. Then they wrapped his body in an old ceremonial robe from the sacristy and buried him, but not in a traditional grave. They desecrated an old pet burial site, one that belonged to a congregation member, and buried your father beneath it. No headstone, no marker, just roots and soil. A knot twisted in Marcus's chest. They buried him in a dog's grave, he whispered. They wanted to hide him in plain sight, the officer replied. They figured no one would ever look there. Marcus clenched his fists. To distance the remaining evidence, the officer went on. They filled that old Adidas bag with your father's Bible, his robe, and a few personal items. Then they paid someone using church funds, no less, to dig a hiding spot deep in the forest, under an old stump, where a logger had felled a tree years earlier. They needed a location they could remember, but one unlikely to ever be found. The details made Marcus's skin crawl. Why didn't the police ever question them back then? He asked hoarsely. Detective Miller stepped forward, her expression clouded with guilt. They used their positions and the racial tensions of that time to stall the investigation. Said your father left voluntarily, that he'd been struggling with grief. And sadly, the community didn't push for more. The case faded, became local legend. She placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The way you discovered your father's Bible, that notebook, his diary, Marcus, this wasn't just coincidence. It's like something wanted the truth revealed. Marcus's eyes drifted to his father's sermon notes again. He reread the words, confront wrongdoing with truth and grace, not for punishment, but for redemption. Even at the end, his father had been trying to do what was right. What happens now? Marcus asked, his voice steadier. We'll move forward with charges, Miller replied. First-degree murder, obstruction of justice, embezzlement. Given George's confession and the physical evidence, it's highly likely both men will spend the rest of their lives in prison. Marcus nodded. And what about my father's remains? We'll get confirmation through DNA, she said. Once that's complete, you'll have the right to arrange for a proper burial, with dignity. Marcus closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him. After 2.5 decades, his father would finally be honored, not whispered about in shameful speculation, not forgotten beneath the roots of a hidden grave. Divine intervention, he murmured. Maybe so. It was past midnight when Marcus left the station. The town had gone quiet and the hospital was well beyond visiting hours, but when he explained the circumstances, the staff made an exception. Nurse Jenkins led him to the pediatric wing, where Robbie lay awake in bed. The boy looked better. His fever had broken, and the color had returned to his cheeks. In the corner sat his aunt and uncle, their expressions weary but grateful. The woman stood as Marcus entered. Mr. Freeman, she said. Robbie told us everything. Thank you for bringing him in. Marcus gave a small smile. I was just in the right place at the right time. When he introduced himself fully, their eyes widened. Freeman? The uncle echoed. As in Elijah Freeman? That was my father, Marcus said. The man nodded. That name still echoes in this town. That case. It's stuck with people. Nobody ever really forgot. Robbie perked up, sitting up straighter in his bed. You came, he said with a grin. I waited for you. I'm sorry I took so long, Marcus said, taking a seat at the boy's bedside. Something important came up and I had to help the police. Are you a cop too? Robbie asked, wide-eyed. No, Marcus said with a laugh. Just a guy trying to do the right thing. He reached into his coat and pulled out the communion set, still carefully wrapped in cloth. Robbie's aunt raised a brow. There's no pastor here to lead the ritual? Marcus met her gaze and spoke with a clarity that surprised even him. "I'm not a pastor, not a perfect man either, just someone who's made mistakes and tried to find his way back. But the faith we share, that's still real. That's still sacred." She nodded slowly, her skepticism softening. With reverence, Marcus opened the communion kit. He arranged the pieces gently on the movable hospital tray and began to speak the words he'd heard his father say so many times before. He broke the bread, offering it to Robbie and his guardians. He poured the juice into tiny cups and passed them around. There, in that dim hospital room, surrounded by old chairs and beeping monitors, Marcus found a strange kind of peace. As they bowed their heads and shared in the holy ritual, the heaviness that had long gripped his spirit began to lift. Robbie looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Will I see you again?" "I think so," Marcus said. "Actually, I hope so. Mount Olive Church, well, let's just say it's going to need some good people around in the coming weeks. People who care about truth and healing." Robbie smiled shyly. "I want to be a kind man like you when I grow up." Marcus reached out and gave the boy a gentle hug. "You already are." Later that night, as Marcus stepped outside into the cool Arkansas air, he looked up at the sky, clear and endless above the hospital parking lot. He closed his eyes and offered a prayer, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. It was the first honest prayer he'd spoken in a long, long time. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not letting the truth stay buried." And somewhere deep within him, a light flickered back to life. For the first time in 25 years, Marcus Freeman prayed with an open heart. No bitterness, no demands, just a quiet confession. He admitted to himself and to the heavens above that he had been wrong to carry resentment toward God all this time. The grief, the unanswered questions, the long silence, they had twisted his spirit into something hardened and guarded. But now, standing on the other side of a day that had forever changed him, he could finally see how it had all been leading him here. He thought back on the seemingly ordinary moments that had nudged him forward. A sick boy crying beside a gravestone, a forgotten sermon notebook left behind on a church table, an old book on stewardship hidden high on a library shelf. None of these things had felt significant at the time, but now, in hindsight, they formed a delicate thread, each choice and coincidence pulling him closer to the truth that had been buried for decades. God, it seemed, had not been silent. He had simply been patient. It was Robbie, a child Marcus had never met before that morning, who unknowingly led him back into the church. It was a decision to help, to show kindness even in the middle of his own sorrow, that cracked open the door to revelation. Through every step, it felt as though some unseen hand had been guiding him. The very act of serving someone else had cleared a path for healing and for answers. He marveled at how real intentional evil had gone unchecked for so long, how the betrayal of trusted spiritual leaders had cast a shadow over his family for decades. And yet, in the end, the truth had emerged. Justice would be served, and the God his father had served with quiet strength and unshakable conviction had not abandoned them after all. As Marcus drove home beneath a canopy of stars, he began to form a plan. When the investigation was complete, he would bury his father properly, with dignity, with truth. He would reconnect with the congregation at Mount Olive and help them understand the man their pastor truly was. And perhaps he thought he might find his own way back to faith, not in spite of what had happened, but because of it. He stepped out of his car, looked up at the night sky, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you."